In this video, I will share 10 common Google Analytics 4 setup mistakes that you should avoid. Hey, my name is Julius and welcome to the Analytics Mania YouTube channel, where I teach people how to work with Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. So if you want to stay up to date with GA4, then consider subscribing to this channel. After working a lot with Google Analytics 4, I've noticed a bunch of common mistakes that people do in their configurations. So I decided to share them with you. Some of them are pretty basic, some of them are not. This is not some definitive ultimate list of mistakes. These are just problems that I often see, and I wanted to help you avoid them. So that's it for the intro, and let's dive in. The first mistake is related to e-commerce tracking with Google Analytics 4. Even if your website is operating in one currency, you still must send the currency code with your purchase event. In Universal Analytics, currency was not required, but it is required in GA4. So you should check your purchase event tag in Google Tag Manager if you're using GTM to send the purchase data, and make sure that one of the parameters is called currency. And here you should enter either some variable that returns the currency code, or you can just enter the currency code like this that you're using in your property. If you're using euros, then you should enter this code. If you're using US dollars, you should enter this code. This parameter supports currency codes that are following the ISO standard, and that standard requires to use 3 symbols like this one. If you try to use something like this, it will not work. Another mistake is related to a feature that Google introduced, which is supposed to help you migrate from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4 faster. But personally, I don't recommend using that. That feature is available in the admin of GA4. Then go to Data Streams, select your website data stream, then More Tagging Settings, and then you will see this option. This option is designed to reuse your existing old Universal Analytics code, which is called analytics.js, and it looks something like that, where you have analytics.js. So this code is using GA commands, for example, GA create, GA send. So if you have this kind of code implemented on your site, and I mean directly in the source code of the website, then this feature is supposed to help you reuse that data and send it to Google Analytics 4 as well. For that, you would need to have gtag also implemented directly in the source code of the website. Gtag looks something like this. So if this feature is enabled, various events using event action, event category, event label, they would be also sent to your Google Analytics 4 property. But in that case, you lose a lot of flexibility, because if you're considering to migrate to GA4 from Universal Analytics, this is your chance to rethink your naming convention, rethink your tracking strategy. And by using this feature, you would lose that possibility because the naming convention is very strict. For example, event action coming from this tracking code would be used as your event name. And then event category with event label would be sent as additional parameters. So if your naming convention in the old version of Google Analytics was not great, that will be transferred to Google Analytics 4. Instead, what I would recommend is that if you use the old Google Analytics tracking code on your website, now is a great moment to migrate to Google Tag Manager and then install Google Analytics 4 there. Yes, this requires more time and more planning, but in the long run, you would win. So I strongly recommend that you do not use this feature. Then another mistake is related to Google Analytics 4 debug view. This is a great feature that allows you to debug incoming events at a very granular level. You would be able to see various events, what kind of parameters are you getting, what are their values. However, you won't see all events right here. You will see only those events that are sent from devices or browsers that have Google Tag Manager preview mode enabled, or those devices have installed Google Analytics Debugger extension and that extension is enabled. You can see that by checking all your extensions, and if you see on badge right here, then it means that the extension is enabled. And the third option would be to send a debug mode parameter with every event. That can be done by adding, let's say, to the Google Analytics 4 configuration tag, a parameter which is called debug mode. And if this parameter contains any value, that event will be included right here. Now, the mistake that I see sometimes people do is that they just enter something like this, and then they click save and publish these changes. What happens is that now all events from all visitors will have this configuration, meaning that you will see hundreds, maybe even thousands of events right here. This makes the debugging process very difficult. and you will have hard time finding your device somewhere right here. So what I would personally recommend is that either you use Google Tag Manager, and because of the preview mode is enabled, your events will automatically be visible right here, or you just enable Google Analytics 4 debugger extension. You activate it on the website. It is enough to do that just by clicking this icon right here, and then this is enabled right now. So when you do either of those things, you will start seeing your debug events right here. Don't try to blindly add just debug mode and then true, because this will apply to all the visitors if you publish these changes. Another mistake is noticed among some beginners of Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics 4. So when they start sending some event, for example, generate lead, they get an impression that they also need to register that event in the interface of Google Analytics 4. So what they do is that they go to configure, events, and then create event, and then create a rule that might look something like this. They just name that rule, let's say like this, and then they enter that very same name right here. This feature is needed only when you want to create additional events based on your already incoming events. So for example, if you had, let's say, page view event, and that page view occurs on a particular page location that contains, let's say, thank you or something like that, then it makes sense to have this kind of configuration. But if you're already sending an event from Google Tag Manager or GTag, you don't have to create an event rule right here. Because if you do this like that, you will then have two identical events. One will be sent from Google Tag Manager, for example, and this is the event name. And then Google Analytics will create a new event based on that received event. So you will have two generate lead events for every, let's say, form submission or some other important interaction on your website. So don't register your events in Google Analytics 4 if you're already sending them. It is completely enough just to have your configuration, for example, in Tag Manager, and that's it. Within the next 24 hours, you will start seeing that generate lead in the list of your events. Do not use create event to register an event that is already being sent. Another mistake is more subjective, meaning that it is not necessarily a mistake, but I would personally not do that. And if you want, you can do otherwise. So this is up to you. When you were sending events with Universal Analytics, you had to fill in 3 fields: event category, event action, and event label. There's also event value, but in this case, let's focus on these 3 items. So in this case, some people, when they implement event tracking with Google Analytics 4, they might want to reuse that naming convention. So they would do something like that, where they have event name and then they send event action and event label, or they might also send event category. That also means something in that context. So technically, this is possible. You are free to do so. But in this case, I would recommend for you to rethink your naming convention and not migrate event action, label, and category. Instead, think of more descriptive parameter names. For example, here, let's say that we have 2 events. One is banner displayed, and action is the name of the banner, and then label is the ID of the banner. And these values would change depending on what kind of banner was displayed. Then we have another event in Universal Analytics, and this time the category is form submission, and then action will be the name of the form, and then label is part of the URL or the address of the page where that form was submitted. So instead of just blindly migrating event category, action, and label, here's what I would suggest. But again, this is not set in stone, and you are in charge here, so you make the final decision. But personally, here's what I would do. In case of banner displayed, I would have event name, which is banner displayed. And here I would have element name that describes the name of the banner. Then I could also send the element ID, which means the banner ID. Then when it comes to form submission, here I could send another event and I would reuse the same parameter name, which is element name, and that is the one that I used right here. And in this case, the value would be the name of the form. I don't need to send page path because page location is automatically tracked with all events in Google Analytics 4. So the first event is related to a website element, which is banner. Therefore, element name is the name of the banner. In this case, website element is the form because it was submitted. So if I create a report for generate lead event and I add element name dimension, I will know that in this context, the value is the name of the form. But here you have to be careful because that's where we come to the next mistake. If you choose not to go with event category, event action, and event label in Google Analytics 4 setup, be aware of certain limitations in Google Analytics 4. Because if you decide to go with too many unique parameter names and you register them as custom dimensions, you will end up reaching the maximum limit of 50 custom dimensions per property. So let's continue with this example. But instead of trying to reuse certain parameters in multiple events, you might want to go like this. We're talking about banner displayed event, so you use banner name, banner ID, and when you are talking about form tracking, then you decide to go with different parameter names such as form name, maybe form ID, maybe something like that. So if you want to later use these parameters as dimensions in your Google Analytics 4 interface, you will have to register these parameters as custom dimensions. That applies to banner name, banner ID, and form name. So if you track a lot of events and you are using a lot of unique parameter names, you will pretty quickly reach that limit of 50 custom dimensions. So here, for example, we would need to register 3 custom dimensions, while in the previous example, you would need to register just 2 of them because element name is shared between generate lead and banner displayed event. So when you are planning your naming convention, it is a good practice to list all of your events and their parameters in a Google Sheet and then try to unify your parameter naming convention. Maybe you can come up with some parameter that can be used, let's say, by 5 or 10 different events. In this case, you might say, well, if I used event category, event action, and event label, I would not have this problem. Well, sure, you would not have it. But when I build a report and I'm looking for particular dimensions, I might not remember what event action or event label returns or what kind of value does it contain for that particular event. While element name is pretty self-explanatory. I know that in the context of banner displayed, element name will be the name of the banner, while in this case, it will be the name of the form. The next mistake applies to those who are just starting with Google Analytics 4, and it is related to data retention. If you go to admin and then go to data settings of your GA4 property, then click data retention. By default, data retention is 2 months. It means that your exploration reports will be able to use the data only from the last 2 months, which is obviously not enough. So when you create a new property, you should go to this section and then switch to 14 months. It means that you will be able to use the data from the last 14 months in your Google Analytics 4 exploration reports. However, keep in mind that data retention does not apply to standard reports, which are right here. They will still work and show data even of older periods, let's say 2 years ago, if of course you have been collecting data for the last 2 years. Once you change the data retention settings, click Save. The next mistake applies to businesses that have multiple versions of the same website. For example, you have your live website where your visitors are coming, and then your developers are working on a test website where they implement new features, they test them, and then after those changes are properly tested, then they push them to the live website. Now, the problem that you might have here is that maybe you're using the same Google Analytics 4 property both in live website and testing website. This means that your developers and your test traffic is polluting your live website's data. In that case, what I would recommend is to create 2 separate Google Analytics 4 properties. One for the live website and one for the test website. Just like I have right here. One property for the live website and one for the testing website. And there are different ways how you can achieve this. You might have different Google Tag Manager containers or just different Google Analytics 4 tracking codes implemented on a site. But if you have decided to have one Google Tag Manager container that runs on both test and live websites, then take a look at the description of this video where I have another tutorial that explains how to deal with test websites and when you're using lookup tables. Then another mistake is related to excluding your own traffic if you are browsing your live site or if your other colleagues are browsing your live website. In that case, you should configure data filter to exclude internal traffic. To do that, first of all, you will need to go to the settings of the data stream, then go to more tagging settings, and then go to define internal traffic. And here you should create rules for different IP addresses of your employees. Once you configure that, then you will need to go to the settings of the property, data settings, data filters, and then set this internal traffic to active. You can do that by clicking on the filter and then setting it to active. Also, a quick bonus for this particular tip, if you have a website where people can make a purchase and before they do that, they need to go to the website of the payment provider. For example, they go to paypal.com and then later when they make a payment, they might come back to your site. As a result, you might start seeing paypal.com in your acquisition reports. For example, if you go to reports and acquisition and then traffic acquisition, you might find paypal.com if you switch to session source. So if you don't want to see the paypal.com right here, then you should go to admin, data streams, select your website data stream, more tagging settings, list unwanted referrals, and then enter paypal.com right here. If you have other payment providers that redirect visitor to their site and then the visitor comes back to your site, then you should enter their domains as well. In this context, referral domain means the domain of the site from which visitor goes to your site. And the last mistake is more technical, but it is definitely something that is important for you to understand. Let's say that I have a website where people can browse without logging in, but also somewhere in the session they might decide to log in and then continue browsing. So in this case, I find it useful to track the login status. If the visitor is logged in, then the value that I will send to Google Analytics will be true, and this is the parameter name. And if user is not logged in, then the value of this parameter will be set to false. So in this case, what I did is that I included that login status parameter only in the GA4 configuration tag right here. And all other event tags, they are using this GA4 config tag. So what I would expect is that every time some other events are firing on the website, they would reuse some settings from the configuration tag, including the login status. So login status will then apply not only to page view, for example, but also to generate lead or menu link click event. So now let's see how this works. Here I have enabled the preview mode. Here is the website. And now let's refresh the page. In the data layer, there is no information about login status. So it means that the user hasn't logged in yet. So if I click on container loaded and on the GA4 config, the value will be false. This is false because I have configured a data layer variable that either returns the login status from the data layer, but if this value is not available, then it will return false. So far, this works well. Now, if I click on any of these menu links, a link click event will appear and then my menu link click event will be sent. However, if I click right here, I will not see that login status. So I might think that this parameter right here is not reused by other tags. However, if I go to the debug view and I click on the menu link click event right here, I will see the login status is properly sent. It happens because when you set a particular parameter in the configuration tag, its value that was sent right here when this tag was activated, it will apply to all the future events within that page view. In other words, until the page is reloaded or the visitor goes to another page when the entire page reloads. So now this login status was set to false, and that false value will apply to all the subsequent events that occur on this particular page. If the visitor logs in and the login status changes to true and then the page reloads, then this tag will get the value true, and then all other events on that particular page view will be also using that true value. But here is one problem, which is right now inconvenient, and I hope that in the future Google Analytics will introduce some solution. So as I've said, this value is set once per page when this tag fires, and then all other events that are using this tag will continue reusing that particular value. So if on the page load we have login status false, all other events on that page will also get the value false. But what if, without reloading the page, I log in and the value changes from false to true? Let's see what happens. So now I will fake in the console that the visitor has logged in, and now the login status will be true. That login event will appear right here. And now I see that my data layer variable is returning true. So with this link click, the value was still false. And because the value false was set with the configuration tag, all other events will inherit that. But what happens if the login status changes? Now, if I click on the link again, another link click will occur right here. And let's check what happens in the debug view. Here is the latest menu link click. And if I click it and go to login status, it is still false, even though that link click happened after the login. This is happening because this is kind of set in stone on that particular page. Even if login status has changed somewhere on that page, all events will still be reusing that initial value, which was set on container loaded. So if you want that every Google Analytics 4 tag would get the latest value of the login status, you will need to include that login status parameter not only in your configuration tag, like here, but you will also need to include this in all other GA4 event tags. And this is inconvenient. But right now, there is no good solution to overcome this, or, maybe have some sort of Google Analytics 4 settings variable where you store the settings and then all tags reuse that. So all in all, you will need to set login status or maybe some other parameter that you have in mind in all other tags as well. This is manual, inconvenient, but that's the current reality. So you do like this in one tag, then in another, and do the same thing for all GA4 tags. Now let's check how this works. Click preview. Right now there is no login information, so on container loaded, the configuration tag fired and it set the value to false. Now let me click the menu link. We don't see that value right here, I mean the login status, but it will be available in the debug view. Click the event and login status is false. Now let me pretend that I have logged in. So I will add a particular command to the developer console. I'm sending login status true. Now the login status variable also returns true. Now let me click the link once again. This time the link click fired. And now if I go to the debug view and wait for another menu link click event, and I click it, now its status is true. So it gets the latest value. And this kind of configuration mistake where the dimension is set only in the configuration tag is very popular among those who are working with single page applications, where the page content dynamically loads, but the actual browser window usually never reloads. So the key takeaway here is that you should include this kind of parameter in all GA4 events if you want to make sure that they get the latest value. And these were the mistakes that you should avoid in the configuration of Google Analytics 4. Of course, there are many other possible mistakes that you can make, but I hope that at least some of these tips were helpful. And if you want to avoid a bunch of other mistakes and you want to properly learn Google Analytics 4, then take a look at my premium course. I will post a link to it below the video. If you found this video useful, hit the thumbs up button below the video because it helps me continue working on this channel. Also, if you want to learn more about Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics 4, then consider subscribing to this channel. My name is Julius, this is Analytics Mania, and I'll see you in the next video.